This week we are going to dive into the classical era. We will see that the music is going to change quite drastically from the Baroque era. The melodies are less complex. The audiences were wanting more to be able to have a melody that they could hum as they were leaving the concert, and the forms are more recognizable. We have more of a definite A form or A-B form where you hear melodies returning and it's more organized. They felt it sounded more organized and less complex. So be sure that you are reading pages 187 to 204 and from 226 to 228. The classical era lasted from 1750 to 1820. You'll notice that's actually the year that Bach died. So Bach closed the era of the Baroque era and the classical era began. This is one of your big information slides. Remember I talked about how that your final exam and other exams in between now and the final exam, I want you to discuss how the orchestra and how instrumental music changes throughout history. Well, let's look and see what the classical orchestra is like compared to the Baroque era, and I'll sometimes shoot into the 20th century and see how it's changing to there. But in the classical orchestra, you now have strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Remember in the Baroque era, it was primarily strings, very few woodwinds, very few brass, very little percussion, because the string instruments were better developed. The winds and brass were still being developed as instruments, and they had a few problems. Orchestras were getting larger with up to 60 performers. So the Baroque era, you pretty well maxed out at 30, and during the classical era, you would have up to 60. Take you up into a modern orchestra, you might have 100 or more performers on stage. But in the classical era, you have around 60 is going to be your maximum amount to have on the stage. Violins almost always have the melody. Interestingly, that's why violins really like the classical era music, and sometimes they struggle with modern music or even sometimes romantic era music because they don't have the melody, and violinists like to have the melody. But during the classical era, they almost always had the melody, so violinists love to play classical music. The strings were still the most important section. As I said, the string instruments were the most well-developed instrument, and they carried the mass majority of the load of the piece. Because in the strings you have, from your high instruments in the violins, you have your middle instrument sounds with the viola and cello, and your low sounds with cello included, and the bass. And so that carried the biggest portion of the music. And then the woodwinds would add contrasting tone color and solos. So if they wanted the strings would play and they wanted to change the tone color a little bit, they would add some winds in there. And then ever so often, a soloist in the wind section. The brass added power when needed, so they were only used as kind of a spice in your recipe. Something that was used sparingly, but they added power where they needed a bigger sounding section. And the timpani, which was the percussion instrument, it was the only percussion instrument, and it was used sparingly. So again, kind of like the hot sauce you would put in there, you don't want to put too much, and so the timpani was just used sparingly for really expressive moments in the music. Take that to today. In the modern orchestra, you may have 25 different percussion instruments, and they're just filling the whole back of the orchestra. But during the classical era, all you had in the percussion section was the timpani. Now there's three terms that you need to know. Number one is symphony, which the definition is a piece for orchestra that is usually in 4 movements. Now, we talked about the symphony orchestra, that is the orchestra that's playing on the stage, but the term symphony itself is a piece for the orchestra that's usually in 4 movements. The string quartet is an ensemble piece comprised of 2 violins, 1 viola, and 1 cello. And the person who invented the string quartet is actually Haydn, and we'll be studying a little bit about him later today. Then the sonata is a piece for one or two instruments. We talked earlier about the sonata versus the cantata. The cantata is sung, the sonata is played. And so that's the difference in those two. The cantata, though, usually has a larger group of musicians performing together, and the sonata is usually one or two instrumentalists playing together. Now let's talk about the emancipation of the composer. Remember, in the Baroque era, the composer was just a servant. They worked just for nobility, and the only way to get a job as a musician was to work for the king or the duke or the prince, someone in nobility or very high up in aristocracy. That is going to change during the classical era. In the early classical era, composers still worked mostly for the nobility or for the church. But by the time you get to the middle classical era, composers began composing and performing for the public, and they also taught private students. So you have the opera houses and you have concert halls where the public are becoming wealthy, more wealthy. They have the means, financial means to be able to go to concerts and to operas. And so the composers are performing and composing for the public. And as I say, this rising middle class also, they're acquiring instruments. They want to learn how to play. And so the number of private music students is increasing, and so they have students to teach. During the late classical era, composers are catering mostly to the rising middle class. Again, opera, private lessons, dance music for public balls, and street performers. So the middle class is really craving and wanting more and more music, and they're investing money into music by going to concerts and providing and taking lessons themselves, providing lessons for their children, wanting to have public dances where they bring in musicians for the dances. Dancing is not just reserved for nobility anymore. And again, you could just perform on the street and people would give you money. And so the composer is no longer tied to royalty or nobility. They can now begin to make a living on their own and become basically self-employed. You're also finding more hotspots for music. The big hotspot in the Baroque era was Venice, Italy. Now it's moving north, and we're going to Vienna, Austria. It's going to be one of the hot spots. So if you're a musician and you want to go where there's lots of concerts going on and lots of opera houses and lots of public participation in music, you're going to be going to Venice or Vienna. Kind of like today, if you want to make it rich in the music industry, you're going to be in New York City or Los Angeles. If you want to be big in the entertainment world, those are the two places you need to try to start your career. And this is the same thing is happening in the classical era. If you want to be in a hot spot, go to Venice or Vienna. And again, music is beginning to move north. The center of music is beginning to move north. One of the major composers of the classical era is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He lived between 1756 and 1791. And we will have a student report on this composer later on in this unit. So let's look a little bit at the music written by Mozart. One of the most important forms during the classical era was the sonata form. First, in the sonata form, you have the exposition. It says the exposition is in the first theme is in tonic or the home key. Then there's a bridge containing a modulation from the home key to the next key. You'll have a second theme in the new key, and then the closing section in the key of the second theme. Then you move into the development. That's the next section of the sonata form. In the development, you have new treatment of themes and modulations to different keys. They're basically developing the melodies that were first exposed to you during the exposition. The third portion of the sonata form is the recapitulation. In the recapitulation, you hear the first theme again, just like you heard it in the exposition. You hear it in the recapitulation, kind of a recap of what you've been listening to. The recapitulation has the first theme in tonic. Then you have a little bridge, and instead of having the second theme go into a new key like it did during the exposition, we stay in the same key. We stay in tonic. And the closing section is also in tonic. Then usually there's a little coda at the end. Coda means little tail ending, and it is in the tonic key, and it just closes the piece. A great example of the sonata form can be found in Mozart's Symphony No. 40. But instead of listening to the fourth movement, which is on page 197, we're going to jump ahead to page 227 and listen to the first movement of Mozart's Symphony No. 40. The instrumentation for this symphony is one flute, two oboes, two clarinets, two bassoons, and two French horns. That makes up your wind and brass section. So as you can see, it's not very large, just like the classical orchestra. And then you have a large number of first violins, second violins, violas, cellos, and double basses. So in the first theme, you're going to hear da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. That's your exposition. The first theme is exposed to you there at that time. That's why it's the exposition. And you have the full orchestra playing here. Then you get this little bridge into the second theme, and the second theme is da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum. And so it's different sounding, but that's your second theme. And it changes keys for us. We get a different tonal center. Then you have the closing section. We go into the development 4 minutes in. And so it's developing the main theme that we heard in the exposition. And then in 5 minutes in, 5 minutes 21 seconds in, you hear that main theme again, where you hear the da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, just like you heard in the exposition. And there's a bridge. The second theme stays in the same key instead of moving to a new key. You have your closing section and the coda. Click on the YouTube link to hear this symphony. Now let's jump back to page 199. And we will look at a piece written by Franz Joseph Haydn, who lived between 1732 and 1809. He is another one of our composers that we will have a student report about, and so we look forward to that. But let's look at his piece, The Surprise Symphony, which is in a theme and variation form. In a theme and variations, a basic musical idea, which is called the theme, is repeated over and over and is changed each time. Haydn's Surprise Symphony is in the theme and variation form. If you look on page 200 and 201, you will see the listening guide for this symphony. Now, an interesting story about this is the second movement, and as I pointed out, often the public would come to hear a concert. It would include dinner and then music. And so after a big dinner, when the music has come on, everyone's settling in, the second movement is usually the softer, slower movement. And everyone in the audience was beginning to nod off to sleep and get drowsy and fall asleep, as often happens after a big meal and some quiet music. Haydn got tired of his audience falling asleep in his second movement, so he decided to add a little surprise. In this surprise symphony, you have this nice, quiet, soft section, and slow, even slower and softer. Then he throws in these big, loud chords to surprise the audience and wake them up. So Haydn had a real sense of humor, and we'll see more of that as we study more of his music. Click on the YouTube link to hear Haydn's Surprise Symphony. The minuet and trio, or minuet, is often used as the third movement of classical symphonies, string quartets, and other works. And it was originated as a dance. It first appeared in the court of Louis XIV of France around 1650, and was danced by aristocrats throughout the 18th century. It was a stately, dignified dance where the dancing couple exchanged curtsies and bows. So it was invented during the Baroque era, very stately, in triple meter, and it was primarily danced by the nobility. And even though it was invented in the Baroque era, everyone just grew to love the minuet, and it was used extensively throughout the classical era as well. So watch the little video clip that shows the minuet, the dance of the minuet. If you look on page 202 and 203, you will see the listening guide to Eine kleine Nachtmusik, Movement 3 by Mozart, and it is a minuet. The listening guide shows how that this minuet is in ABA form. It's not a very long piece, and so go ahead and click on the link and listen to this minuet by Mozart. Beethoven rounds out the three most important composers of the classical era. We had Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, and we will have a student report on Beethoven as well up and coming. Beethoven was born in 1770 and died in 1827. And he wrote the next piece that we're going to listen to, which is in the rondo form. On page 203 and 204, you will read about Beethoven's string quartet in C minor, which is in the rondo form. It says the rondo features a tuneful main theme, which is your A section, that returns several times in alternation with other themes. The common rondo patterns are A, B, A, C, A. And it can even go longer and be, as we will see in this piece, A, B, A, C, A, B, A. And so A keeps returning, and then other themes are thrown in between. And this piece is a string quartet. So if you remember, the string quartet is two violinists, a viola, and a cello. And the string quartet was actually invented by Haydn, but all the composers, once the string quartet was discovered, they said this is a great instrumentation, and all the composers began to write string quartets. So this is a string quartet by Beethoven, and it is in C minor in rondo form. Click on the YouTube link to hear this string quartet. You can see how music is changing and developing over time. Again, this is what we're going to be discussing on your final exam. How does music change from the beginning of time to modern day? Instrumentally, how does it change? Vocally, how does it change? And so as we're getting into the classical era, you can see a lot of changes from Bible times and from the Renaissance and the Middle Ages. You can see things are changing. Be sure you're listening to the musical examples. This will help you to better understand the changes that are happening in music and the evolution that's happening in music to make music what it is today and what we listen to today. All right.